from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. I agree completely with my colleague who has really shown significant leadership on this area, worked closely with it. He's been a governor for 2 terms, knows about appointments, knows about advise and consent. And what we have seen from this President of the United States just last January, a flagrant disregard for the Constitution and the laws of this land by bypassing the Senate and appointing 3 members to the National Labor Relations Board, claiming the Senate was in recess, even though the Senate was meeting regularly in pro forma session. So last week, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled unanimously, Madam President, that those unilateral appointments were unconstitutional. And it's interesting because I saw the whip of the Democrat Party on one of the television shows this weekend and said, well, you know, we need to make sure that people have plenty of time for hearings. They didn't have hearings. Madam President, the Democrats are in control of the United States Senate. They could have called hearings but chose not to. The President let these vacancies sit for long periods of time, and only in the middle of December of 2011 did he even put names up, and then summarily just a few weeks later went and did a recess appointment. The Senate was really never consulted. The Senate didn't have an opportunity to advise and consent. And that's why I use the word flagrant in terms of the President's bypassing of the Senate in making these recess appointments. Well, over the weekend, newspapers across this country reported on this consequential ruling by the court and what it will mean for the administration going forward. The Wall Street Journal called it Obama's abuse of power. Abuse of power. Politico said President Obama's recess appointment bet sours. Investors Business Daily reported that, quote, the court finally reins in Obama's imperial presidency. The Washington Post explained that, quote, court says Obama exceeded authority in making appointments. The Los Angeles Times reported that, quote, court rules Obama's recess appointments are illegal. Illegal, Madam President. After we go on reading through all of this, after this court ruling, the White House should finally realize that the President's power to use recess appointments is not unlimited. The court's decision reaffirms that America's founding fathers provided the Senate, a responsibility, a duty to advise and consent, and they did it with the strong, co-equal responsibility on important nominations. Well, let's take a look at what the U.S. Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia actually ruled when they talked about the President's so-called recess appointments. The court said, quote, an interpretation of, quote, the recess, close quote, that permits the President to decide when the President is in recess would demolish, Madam President, the court says, demolish the checks and balances inherent in the advice and consent requirement, giving the President free rein, they say, to appoint his desired nominees at any time he pleases. They went on to say, whether that time be a weekend, lunch, or even when the Senate is in session and he is merely displeased with its inaction. The court went on to say, this cannot be the law. And I agree completely with the court, which is why I'm here on the floor of the Senate with my colleagues. Senator Johans, also a former governor, is with us today. These are individuals who understand the importance of advise and consent. And again, with Senator Johans, he's been a cabinet member. He has been subjected to the process of advise and consent, and he knows how important that is in the balance of power in how Washington and our nation was supposed to work by the Constitution. As the court wrote, allowing the President to define the scope of his own appointments power would eviscerate, the court said, eviscerate the Constitution's separation of powers. The court added, it would make little sense, they said, to extend the recess appointment authority to any intra-session break, because the ability to make recess appointments would swallow the advice and consent role of the Senate. Well, because of the President's illegitimate appointments, which is what they are, illegitimate appointments, the NLRB is now operating under a cloud of uncertainty. a cloud of uncertainty all across the country in all of their regulations and rules. And that's why, shortly after the appointments, the President's appointees to the NLRB, Sharon Block and Terrence Flynn and Richard Griffin, began issuing orders and opinions in labor disputes. So they've been doing that now for over a year. Now all of those decisions that the board issued by a quorum made up by those members, and there are over 200 of those rulings coming out in the past year, they are subject to challenge and to invalidation. We've heard from Senator Alexander. One of those having to do with micro unions. Another had to do with collection of union dues, even after there was no, even after the contracts had expired. But on and on and on. Numbers of rulings, over 200, have been made. They are all subject to challenge and invalidation because there really was no legitimate quorum for the National Labor Relations Board. At this moment, it's practically impossible for anyone to know which NLRB decisions are valid and which aren't. It's my opinion that none of them should be valid. But it's time to stop this regulatory train wreck from getting any worse. That's why this week I'm introducing a bill that will freeze any decisions, any regulations, any rulings made by this unconstitutionally appointed and invalid quorum of the National Labor Relations Board. Until we have final resolution from the courts, the NLRB should not be able to move forward and create even more uncertainty across this country. Now, we wouldn't be in this position if the President of the United States had done what legally he is mandated to do, which is work with Congress and follow the Constitution. So I hope that this court ruling serves as a wake-up call for President Obama and for his entire administration. Instead of going around Congress, instead of going around the Constitution, it is time for the Obama administration to work with us on nominations. Thank you, Madam President. I see that the senator from Nebraska is here, the former governor, former cabinet member, and I look forward to hearing his comments as well. Thank you, Madam President.